In the house, shrouded in the darkness of night, sounds of splashing and sloshing echoed through the halls. A winsome young man lay on crumpled sheets, engulfed in delightful moans, tears streaming from the corners of his eyes. A man whose face was hidden in the shadows declared that he would contact the boy tomorrow. In the morning, barely lifting his eyelids, the first thing Louis saw was a red-haired girl named Sabrina. Sitting up in bed, he clutched his head, which traitorously throbbed after a tumultuous night. Sabrina, exhaling and placing her hands on her hips, inquired whether the captain had remembered about the morning combat training. As Louis swept his hair back, he noted that the alarm had failed to go off again. It was already well past 10. Sabrina, glancing at the young man, urged him to hurry up and get ready. Approaching the wardrobe, Louis began dressing and asked his partner to wait for him downstairs. The girl, opening the door, looked back at the captain over her shoulder. He, brushing it off, assured her that he was fine and there was no need for concern. Sabrina was relieved to hear this and disappeared through the door the next moment. As soon as the door slammed shut, Louis nervously scratched his own neck, recalling the dream from the previous night. However, he did not dwell on it for long, and soon he was at the training. The session was in full swing. An opponent lunged, intending to attack Louis. Louis dodged, simultaneously explaining that when an opponent attacks head-on, one must seize and throw them to the ground, which he promptly did to his opponent. Straightening up, the captain surveyed the onlookers and asked if anyone wished to repeat the move. From the crowd came exclamations of admiration. Some regarded Louis as incredible, others simply praised him. Wiping sweat from his face, the man, having received no response to his question, decided to choose a new opponent himself. Suddenly, his eyes widened in surprise. Doubling over, he covered his mouth with his hand as if about to vomit. Louis's head spun, and he began to lose consciousness, eventually collapsing onto the grass. The captain awoke later that evening, opening his eyes without immediately realizing where he was. It was already 7 in the evening, a fact relayed to him by the medic Peter Elwin, who happened to be nearby and noticed Louis stirring from his slumber. Digesting the information slower than usual, the man continued to lie in bed, staring at the ceiling. Suddenly, he propped himself up on his elbows, asking about the time in surprise. Louis also inquired why he had lost consciousness. Peter clasped his head, exhaling nervously, and stating that explaining the situation would be quite complex. Seeing the anxiety on the stranger's face, the captain slightly leaned to the side. The medic slumped, covering his face with papers, at a loss on how to inform the man of his diagnosis. Louis closed his eyes, calmly declaring that he was prepared to face any blow fate might deal, and urged him not to delay and just tell it as it is. Taking a stool nearby, Peter moved it closer to the bed and sat down. Life had not prepared the medic for such blows of fate, and so he began by asking probing questions, like whether the man had felt odd over the last 4 months. Crossing his arms, the captain looked puzzled and asked what Peter meant. Completely flustered, Peter cited frequent dizziness, nausea, back and stomach pains as examples. Louis, after some thought, confirmed these speculations. He also mentioned that due to the nausea, he had been unable to eat anything but fruits the previous month, though now he was feeling normal again. The medic echoed his words, growing more worried. In jest, the captain asked if it was time to start preparing a will. But Peter set aside all jokes, extending the papers and asking the man to look at them. Louis teasingly criticized the medic's handwriting, causing Peter to wave him off irritably, urging him to look not at the handwriting, but at what was written at the bottom. Written starkly at the bottom was 4th month of pregnancy. The captain was rendered speechless, his gaze drilling into the paper. Peter immediately began to explain that he had checked everything several times, and it could not be a mistake. Louis, still in shock, pressed a hand to his forehead. The medic brought the man some water, then started asking who the father of the child was and how this had happened. In any case, it was known that only a man tied to the imperial family could impregnate another man. One of the 7 blessings bestowed upon the imperial family by the gods was the gift of fertility. Bearing a child of the imperial lineage was fraught with difficulties, and a scandal could erupt in the capital. Emotionally, Louis decided it would be better to terminate the pregnancy, but he was unsure if it was even possible to find a doctor willing to take such a risk. Peter, still standing by, distracted the man from his thoughts, continuing to speculate on who could be the child's father. The captain looked up uncertainly, confirming that he indeed had an affair 4 months ago, but he could not remember with whom. The word shock was vividly reflected on the medic's face. Lowering his head again, Louis repeated that he simply could not recall. Peter covered his face with his hand, sighing heavily. The whole situation was so absurd that he felt like sinking through the ground. He asked how the captain intended to find out who the father was. After a brief pause, Louis first requested that this remain confidential, including from Sabrina. The next day in his office, leaning on his desk, he tried to listen to the red-haired woman's report, but his mind was adrift. Suddenly, Sabrina called out to him louder than usual, causing him to startle. Noticing the woman standing before him with a stack of papers in her hands, Louis apologized. Moving past, she placed the stack on the desk and asked if he was in pain. His response was negative, though no less uncertain. Sabrina suspected something was amiss and stared at him with a measure of distrust. She began to interrogate Louis about what had happened the day before yesterday, but he dismissed it as a minor ailment. The red-haired woman speculated that it was due to poor nutrition. The captain agreed, acknowledging that he had been too busy lately. Then Sabrina recalled that in the past 4 months, about 5 people had been murdered, and they had yet to find any trace of the killer. Exhaling, she asked if Louis had eaten today. It turned out he had been bought a sandwich. But such an answer did not satisfy the woman, as a simple sandwich was clearly not enough to satiate him. Then the captain excused his lack of appetite lately. He could not possibly admit that his stomach turned at the mere mention of meat. Placing her hands on her hips, Sabrina reminded the captain that one of the knight's life foundations is to take care of his body's condition. And if he was unwell, he should consider retiring. Louis agreed with everything the woman said next, which made him feel even more awkward. Unexpectedly, the red-haired woman asked, when was the last time the captain had come home? The man tried to excuse himself, saying times were tough for everyone, and he could not simply leave his post because he felt unwell. Sabrina then mentioned Leo, who had shamelessly left work the previous day. Louis shrugged, trying to justify his action. There was no need to keep someone at work if they had nothing to do there. The red-haired woman continued to reproach Leo, arguing that if that man had worked properly, the work atmosphere would have been much better by now. Louis, unable to contain his frustration, exhaled irritably, lamenting that all these problems could have been avoided had he found the criminal. Snatching several interconnected papers from a box, Sabrina began to read. She voiced a list of the murderer's deeds and a description of his chosen victims. The first body was discovered 4 months ago, and given the high-quality scarlet satin used to bind the corpse, it was highly probable that the murderer was an aristocrat. The criminal might also be a resident of the district under the jurisdiction of the First Knightly Order, located near the Imperial Palace. Sabrina paused, her eyes lingering on the papers, before she sharply set them down on the table. She was incensed that after spending over 100 days investigating, all they had done was send several inquiries to the First Knightly Order, yet received no response. Louis tried to calm her, noting he had sent a new request, so they needed to wait a few more days. That's when Sabrina exploded, accusing those bastards who simply did not want to cooperate, which stalled the investigation. The captain grew stern, reminding her that insulting the imperial family could result in the death penalty, and she should be more careful with her words. But Sabrina, speaking the truth, refused to apologize. She also mentioned rumors that letters sent in Louis's name were discarded unopened. Frustrated, Louis sighed, declaring he would go later and demand assistance in person. Sabrina explained that she had visited daily for 2 weeks, but the person they needed was never there. Suddenly, another voice was heard. It belonged to Leo, who asked the deputy captain to calm down. Entering the office, the young man suggested Louis attend the banquet, where he was sure to meet the necessary person. It turned out that the captain had also received an invitation, which Leo began searching for among other papers in a box. Finding it, he handed it to Louis. Sabrina could not hide her joy for the man, hence she urged him to go home and prepare for the event. However, Louis was not exactly thrilled. He stared at the unopened letter while his colleagues argued about something. To bolster his confidence, the woman playfully nudged him in the back, instructing him to thoroughly enjoy the banquet. Meanwhile, at the Imperial Palace, a new letter was received and immediately brought to His Highness. The man was impressed with the determination of the Second Knightly Order. Yet he did not intend to respond and ordered to wait until the captain personally appeared at the palace. The young woman, swiftly descending the staircase, did not conceal her genuine joy upon meeting her brother Louis. She threw herself into his arms, expressing how much she had missed him and how long it had been since their last encounter. Joanne began to voice her grievances toward her brother, but he quickly reassured her, and her complaints dissipated. Turning to the servant, the man inquired about Chris, learning that he had been at lectures since the morning. Louis was surprised that there were classes on the weekend, but his sister bluntly stated that Chris had likely gone off to drink again. Choosing to change the subject, the man mentioned that a masquerade ball would be held at the palace that day. Joanne's face lit up, delighted by the prospect of attending together. Caught up in the excitement, she called for Lisa, her maid, to help her prepare for the ball, arranging her hair, selecting her dress, and the like. Hearing this, Lisa assumed a proud demeanor, declaring that she would ensure everything was impeccable. The two men watched the departing women, puzzled by their haste, since they still had more than 6 hours to spare. Louis hadn't anticipated such complications, but the servant hastened to reassure him. His sister was merely anxious because she would be attending the event with a young gentleman. Thus, he should simply accept things as they were and try to spend a bit more time with her. Suddenly, the man asked Louis if there was a lady he was seeing. The young man visibly tensed, denying any such involvement. However, the servant reminisced about the banquet 4 months ago and how Louis had returned home in the early morning hours. He urged Louis to relax and not hide it, as it was natural for a man to be in such relationships. Louis remained unsettled and in a somewhat harsh tone asked the servant to calm down. He quickly apologized, admitting that he had lost his temper. Bowing, the servant also apologized for his indiscretion and asked if Louis was hungry. Louis requested a meal without meat and then proceeded to take a bath. Lying in the hot water, he reflected on how long it had been since he had eaten properly and considered his overall diet. Thoughts of that night 4 months ago also intruded upon his mind. Louis remembered finding a note the following morning with the message, "Contact me." At that time, he could not even recall or piece together the events of the entire evening, let alone remember the face of his partner. As he dressed, the young man was certain that the night had been a mistake and that they were never meant to meet again. Neatly folded clothes and a mask lay on the edge of the bed, prepared for the banquet. When Louis was dressed, a servant entered the room announcing that it was time to depart. The man could not hide his true admiration, remarking on how perfectly the young gentleman's outfit suited him. Louis was pleased that everything was as it should be, as he had been somewhat anxious about it. The final touch was a mask, which he put on while looking at himself in the mirror. The young man knew that not only he, but also the man from the imperial family, with whom he had spent that fateful night, would be at the ball. Before leaving, the servant adjusted the young gentleman's collar, which had been awkwardly positioned. He noted that although Louis had slimmed down a bit, he looked truly magnificent. The young man remained silent at the unusual compliment, so the servant inquired if everything was all right. It turned out Louis was simply remembering that he had worn the same mask at the last ball. The man explained that wearing the same mask was not an issue, as the primary goal of such receptions was to expand one's connections. Outside, his sister awaited him, dressed in a tight-fitting snow-white gown with a matching mask. The men, whispering among themselves, praised Joanne. The lady was the most beautiful in the world, but today she looked even more exquisite. It seemed she heard their words. Tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, she admitted that even if they were flattering her, she still enjoyed hearing it. As they got into the carriage, Louis offered his sister his hand like a true gentleman. The servants, seeing their masters off, wished them a happy journey and a delightful time at the ball. On the way to lighten the mood, the young woman started a conversation. She shared her excitement with her brother, as it had been 4 full months. But for Louis, the time had flown by unnoticed. Recalling that the young man had returned home in the early hours, Joanne asked who the lady had been. Exhaling irritably, the young man swore that he had not been with any lady that night. The girl found it hard to believe, so she asked if she was being deceived. But Louis was telling the pure truth. No one would guess that the person he had spent that night with was a man. Distracting her brother from his reverie, Joanne reminded him of his mask, as they were soon to arrive at their destination. Stepping out of the carriage, the young man also extended his hand to assist her in alighting. At the palace entrance, Joanne noticed that Louis was behaving somewhat oddly. He confessed to feeling slightly unwell, but assured it was nothing serious. He insisted that all was more than in order, and they should seize the opportunity to enjoy the ball. His only concern was the presence of that particular man here, though he would never admit it, even to his own sister. Fireworks exploded in the palace grounds, and inside, the dance was in full swing. Attendees mingled, laughed, shared the latest gossip, and engaged in lively discussions. However, most eyes turned to the twins as they entered. Most whispers centered around Louis and how much handsomer he had become over the past 4 months. A gentleman, ignoring their presence, or rather Joanne's, requested a dance from her. The sister looked questioningly at Louis, who in turn simply encouraged it, suggesting it was good for her to unwind and enjoy herself. Watching the happy couple with a sigh, the young man knew it was now time to find the person for whom he had come. Scanning the crowd where ladies dominated and one man in a white suit stood out, Louis instantly recognized him. He had no desire to approach and inquire about anything. Yet, he didn't need to take any action, as the blond man caught sight of him, casting a glance in Louis's direction. Feeling the piercing gaze, the young man grew nervous. Gathering his courage, he found the fortitude to approach and knelt before his highness, greeting him. The blond man continued to gaze silently at Louis, while ladies whispered behind him, discussing how poorly the two got along. Louis remembered how close they had been in childhood, and wondered why now there was such animosity towards him. Finally, the blond man spoke, chiding Louis for being overly formal at the masquerade. Louis then inquired how he should address him, though he knew it would change little. The answer was simple: metal. The surprise on Lewis's face elicited soft laughter from the ladies opposite. Metal posed a counter-question, but finding Lewis's reply dreadfully dull, decided to nickname him White Rabbit. This unexpected moniker caught him even more off guard, but an explanation soon followed. Louis resembled the white rabbit that Metal had almost caught, but ultimately let slip away. Approaching closer, the blonde extended his hand, commanding him to rise. Louis readily grasped the offered hand, rising from his knees and thanking His Highness for the assistance. As their gazes met, Metal immediately began inquiring why he had lost weight. However, he did not allow the young man to respond, instead continuing to lecture on how caring for one's physical well-being is a fundamental aspect of a knight's life. Louis, somewhat annoyed, tried to pull his hand away, apologizing for a second time as he grew increasingly irritated. He attempted an excuse, but it was so feeble that His Highness did not believe it. The captain decided to shift the conversation, remembering the original purpose of his visit to the ball. Louis requested a few minutes of Metal's time for a serious discussion, and after a slight hesitation he agreed. As the two men moved to a more secluded spot, the ladies who had been watching them felt slightly disappointed. His Highness gripped Louis's wrist firmly before leading him away from the ballroom. Soon they found themselves on a balcony, where the blonde sat on a bench and removed his mask, staring intently at his companion. Louis, feeling uneasy and avoiding eye contact, could not understand why Metal was behaving so peculiarly. Noticing his discomfort, the blonde suggested that he might simply be feeling uneasy. However, Louis quickly dismissed this, apologizing for the third time that evening. Metal waved it off, urging them to get to the matter at hand. Louis began discussing the serial murders and how he had sent several official requests to the palace. The blonde shook his head, indicating he had received no such letters. Louis then speculated that the criminal resided in the district under the jurisdiction of the First Knightly Order. He continued to stress the seriousness of the situation and their need for assistance in the investigation, but Metal appeared disinterested. Eventually, Louis asked His Highness for cooperation, suggesting that with his help, they could apprehend the criminal in less than a day. The blonde propped his head on his hand and succinctly replied that he was not interested. Exhaling, he questioned why he should help at all. He was somewhat offended by the fact that Louis only approached him when in need. The captain awkwardly scratched the back of his head. He could perhaps share a drink or two with him, but each time he felt uncomfortable, which made it difficult for him to just drop by casually. Gathering his thoughts, Louis beseeched His Highness to temporarily reconsider his stance and assist in the investigation. Metal laughed abruptly and rose from his seat. Catching up to his interlocutor, he reached for his mask, removing it from his face and discarding it. Looking down at him, the blonde began to speak of how he was serious when he called Louis the White Rabbit. The young man became visibly nervous as the stranger's hand touched his cheek. From His Highness's words, he understood that there was regret for past actions. Therefore, he asked for a detailed description of the White Rabbit, so he could capture him quickly and bring him to Metal. However, Metal saw no point in chasing the rabbit that had once escaped. That was in the past, and what he needed now was a replacement. More precisely, His Highness required a reliable white rabbit who would not run away, and Louis was perfectly suited for this role. The blonde roughly grabbed the young man by the collar of his shirt, tearing off buttons. The captain gripped the stranger's wrist tightly, fearfully asking what he was doing. Metal hesitated before responding, studying the young man's face, then agreed to help. But he would do so under one condition, if Louis played the role of the rabbit well. With unprecedented audacity, the blonde tousled the other's hair. He ordered him to come to his office the next morning with all the necessary materials. But all Louis was concerned about was what exactly the role of the rabbit entailed. As it turned out, it was merely to do as instructed by the White Rabbit, namely the captain. With a swift movement of his hand, Metal drew the young man closer. He abruptly covered his lips with his own in a demanding kiss, from which Louis could not pull away. The young man blushed and succumbed to the kiss, as if intoxicated. Metal's hand glided across his waist and lifted his shirt, slipping underneath. At that moment, Louis realized where things were heading, and thus broke the kiss, pleading with His Highness to stop. But the blonde leaned in closer to his ear, smiling at such a reaction. He first kissed the young man's neck and then bit the same spot, leaving a noticeable mark from his teeth. Louis reached his breaking point and could not tolerate it any longer, forcefully pushing his partner away. The young man looked disheveled and breathless, but this appearance only pleased Metal, who had aimed for such an effect. Louis found no better excuse than to claim a suddenly arising urgent matter as his reason to leave. After a hurried exit that left him bursting through the doors into the hall, Louis found all eyes abruptly turned upon him. Covering his neck, he hastened away, trying not to notice anyone, especially his sister, who watched him with a look of concern. Once outside, Louis adjusted his clothes, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. He was in unmistakable shock from the encounter, as His Highness was not known for such behavior. He even speculated that Metal might have been the one he had spent that night with. Suddenly, his train of thought was interrupted by a man who appeared out of nowhere, blocking his path. It was Duke Raphael Waiton, who greeted Louis with a worried look. The young man bowed his head and passed by, once again excusing himself with urgent matters. But then, his wrist was boldly seized, stopping him from leaving. The Duke wanted to talk, but upon their eyes meeting, he was struck speechless by the sight of him. Recovering, Raphael inquired why Louis looked so disheveled. Louis did not make excuses and asked to be excused, fearing that that person might catch up to him and worsen the situation. The Duke silently released him, certainly noticing the bite mark on his neck, which visibly upset him. Clutching his chest, Louis hurried away. But then he heard Raphael ask if he had considered what they had discussed last time. Removing his mask, Raphael declared he had given him enough time to think. Louis stopped abruptly, turning to face the Duke, unclear about what he meant. The man reminded him of how he had said his heart was in Louis's hands. The next day, Louis was awakened by his servant, who had spent quite some time trying to rouse the young master. Sitting up, he rubbed his eyes, apologizing for waking up so late. The man explained that no matter how scandalous the rumors were, Louis still needed to work. Louis was confused by his words, and the next moment a newspaper was thrown onto his bed. The headline spoke of the previous night's events at the ball involving him and His Highness, resembling a passage from a scandalous novel. However, the servant had brought the most modest article. Among the tabloids, there were versions claiming Louis had been assaulted. Upon reading the article, Louis delved deeper into the newspaper, dreading what more he might uncover. Indeed, the information was decidedly against him, and he felt increasingly dejected, unsure of how to handle the situation. A gentleman politely inquired if he was involved with His Highness, to which Louis immediately replied in the negative. And there was proof. This person harbored no affection for him. Thus, the whole ordeal was merely his latest amusement. The servant, familiar with this person's temperament, wished his master would be more assertive and not allow himself to be so affected. Ideally, Louis would remain sequestered in the manor, but duties called, so the man boldly threw off the blanket, urging the young master to rise. With an encouraging pat on the back, he advised Louis to lay low for a while, or even better, to be seen with a charming lady. Being seen in the company of a lady would quickly quiet the scandalous rumors. After sending Louis to get ready, the man left to prepare some warm tea and breakfast to lift his spirits. Looking at himself in the mirror, Louis reflected on the previous evening's events. The Duke had demanded an answer. Raphael, observing uncertainty on his face, almost thought Louis was going to pretend he didn't understand the topic. He was upset, not believing that Louis could so ruthlessly trample on the feelings of someone sincere. However, Louis was at a loss for what to say. If the Duke was indeed the one he had slept with, that meant he was also the father of the child he was carrying. A prolonged silence hung between the men, seeming to last an eternity. The next day, a group of journalists had already gathered at Louis's office door, eagerly discussing the incident from the previous night. Louis noticed them with slight surprise at their promptness. It was only morning and they were already there. Despite his attempts to hide around the corner, a young journalist spotted him, immediately calling out to him. Others followed suit, snapping photos, bombarding him with questions. All this slightly overwhelmed Sir Louis, causing him notable disarray. Intentionally ignoring the curious journalists, he tried to make his way to the door, but a young woman blocked it, asking for a few words about the previous day. Unexpectedly, the door swung open and hit the journalist in the back, causing her to stagger and drop her notebook to the floor. Louis deftly caught the journalist in his arms, preventing her from falling. Glancing at her, he inquired if she was hurt. Before the flustered journalist could utter a word, Sabrina emerged from the door, chiding the captain for his tardiness. Seizing the moment, Louis swiftly slipped into his office, while an irate Sabrina deliberately intimidated the gathered crowd to disperse them. Following the captain inside, she shut the door with a slam. Louis, slightly shrugging his shoulders, thanked her for the assistance. Sabrina responded curtly, making it clear she was not in the mood for pleasantries. Dropping all formalities, she reported that a young woman had gone missing at dawn the previous day. The woman, 23 years old, had left a tavern in the district of the First Knightly Order and had not returned home. Attempts to check for any incidents at the tavern were unsuccessful, as the area was under the jurisdiction of the First Order. Captain Louis suggested the possibility of a runaway, but a neighborhood inquiry provided no leads. The locals described the woman as diligent and honest, with no financial troubles or recent drastic changes in her personal life. Turning the page, Sabrina pointed to a photograph of the woman in question, Emily Coyle, an employee at a tavern they frequently visited. It turned out her appearance matched the profile of recent victims of a serial killer operating in the area. Louis became visibly upset, noting that events were unfolding too rapidly. The last body had been found just a few days prior. Suddenly, Sabrina sobbed, holding on to a faint hope that Emily might still be alive. To comfort his friend, the captain embraced her, asserting that they must find her as quickly as possible, no matter what. Lewis did not falter. Grabbing the murder case file, he headed for a meeting with Metal that very morning and was greeted by the vice captain of the First Knightly Order, Jack Trown. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the captain learned that His Highness had instructed that if Louis came in the morning, he should be directed elsewhere. Following Jack, Lewis had no idea where he was being led. They were heading towards a wing of the main palace. Upon arrival, the vice captain took the documents from Lewis's hands, stating that everything needed to be verified first. Realizing where this was heading, Louis attempted to excuse himself, suggesting that if that was the case, it wasn't necessary for him to meet with His Highness. Upon entering the expansive, brightly lit room, the first thing Louis saw was Metal, likely recently awoken, sitting on the bed. Feeling a profound awkwardness, Louis attempted to excuse himself, stating he did not mean to disturb His Highness. But the blonde dismissed his protests, asking him instead to come closer. As Louis approached, Metal requested a kiss, explaining that he wished to start his morning that way. Reluctant to object, Louis complied with His Highness's request. However, the kiss was not enough, and moments later, Louis found himself pushed down onto the still warm bed. Metal, gripping his white rabbit by the shoulders, looked intently at him and remarked that Louis smelled of women's perfume. When asked with whom he had been, Louis remained silent. His Highness then demanded an answer, tightening his grip on Lewis's shoulders. Reflecting briefly, Louis remembered how he had embraced Sabrina that morning in an attempt to comfort her. Metal inquired if they were seeing each other. Louis quickly clarified that wasn't what he meant, which led to an awkward silence hanging between them. After a short pause, Louis spoke up, commenting on the discomfort of their current position. However, His Highness preferred not to change their arrangement, returning instead to the previous inquiry. Louis firmly stated that Metal should not concern himself with whose scent he carried, as it was his personal life. The blonde became more audacious, pressing him seriously why he had come. The captain explained he was there because he had been instructed to come, suggesting that the meeting was official. Hence, His Highness proposed calling the secretary to record their conversation and formalize it as an official document. Touching a bell beside the bed, Metal straightened up and ordered the servant to enter. The servant immediately opened the door and Louis sprang up, clutching his shirt which had been unbuttoned during the encounter. Grabbing the blonde by the wrist, he asked him not to call anyone. His Highness then pressed him further, resulting in Louis admitting defeat. Satisfied, Metal asked the servant to leave. The door slammed shut again, and now the blonde inquired if there was anyone else in Louis's personal life. The answer was negative, which seemed to satisfy His Highness. An awkward silence filled the air again, and the captain shyly averted his gaze, internally acknowledging the blonde's incredible attractiveness. Breaking the silence first, Louis began discussing the disappearance of a woman and his determination to catch the killer as soon as possible. Metal declared that if the White Rabbit could attune himself to his mood, he would expedite the capture of the criminal. By this, His Highness meant that every day, at a time convenient for Louis, he would need to spend about an hour in the royal bedroom. When asked why this was necessary, the blonde reminded him that he had assumed the role of the White Rabbit, and daily visits would certainly please the reporters. Accepting no objections, His Highness swiftly silenced the captain with a kiss, then collapsed onto his side in bed. He requested Louis stay with him for an hour. Closing his eyes, Metal seemed to fall asleep, giving Louis time to ponder what the role of White Rabbit truly entailed. Unnoticed, sleep also overtook him, and he began to dream. Upon opening his eyes in the dream, he saw a verdant forest filled with various animals. Venturing deeper, Louis felt as though someone was waiting for him. His legs froze and he grew nervous. Suddenly, a massive gray dragon with violet eyes landed beside him, extending its clawed paw toward him. Stricken with fear, Louis began to make excuses, but his words faded into the background when tears began to fall from the creature's eyes, a sight Louis could not explain. Awakening with a start, the captain's eyes flew open. Realizing it was just a dream, he sat up in bed, inquiring about the time. Metal sat on a gilded chair across from him, casually crossing his legs. Glancing at his wristwatch, he noted it was about 4 o'clock. While Louis had been asleep, Jack and his vice captain had surveyed the surroundings and questioned the tavern staff. His Highness had already received a report, and when asked why they hadn't awakened him, he inquired whether Louis had eaten breakfast. Rising, Metal approached the captain, noting how his waist was becoming slimmer and the dark circles under his eyes darker due to poor sleep. The blonde couldn't bear to be so harsh as the investigation had yielded no results. Louis could verify this himself if they went to the tavern, the last place the victim had been seen. Surprised, Lewis's eyes widened. Why would His Highness go with him? It turned out this could be considered a sort of date. At the tavern, Lewis once again questioned the owner. The answers were the same as before, unfruitful. Meanwhile, Metal was looking for a cozy spot to settle in for a meal. Initially, Louis couldn't believe the blonde actually intended to do so, but His Highness was serious, arguing that it would be rude to visit a restaurant and not order anything. Summoning the waiter, Metal decided to order everything on the menu, reasoning that with a large selection, at least something would suit his taste. Tapping his finger on the table, Metal instructed Captain Lewis to sit down, assuring him that they would be immediately notified of any new information or leads. Lewis had no choice but to comply with the command. Under the intense gaze of His Highness, Louis became flustered and inquired if everything was all right. In a more disconcerting gesture, as Metal extended his hand towards his face, Lewis failed to notice that the table had already been set, exclusively with meat dishes. He tried to explain that he had been favoring vegetable dishes lately, but Metal seemed indifferent. The blonde recalled how Lewis had tossed and turned in his sleep. Whether it was a nightmare or not, Lewis preferred not to discuss it at the table, feeling it was not an appropriate topic for mealtime conversation. Once the table was fully set, Lewis tentatively tried one of the dishes, but immediately gagged as soon as he put a spoonful in his mouth. He tried to cough it up and apologized for the mishap when Metal leapt up to assist. However, His Highness simply grabbed Louis by the arm and, leaning in, earnestly asked what was causing him pain. Naturally, the captain denied any discomfort, claiming everything was fine and expressing embarrassment about his disheveled appearance. But Metal was unconvinced and ordered him to stand up so they could go to the doctor immediately. Then Louis confessed that he had feigned illness to influence the investigation. Metal interrupted again, pointing out that Lewis had vomited without even swallowing a spoonful, clearly indicating that the captain was unwell. Eventually, Lewis admitted that he had been medically examined a few days ago, but nothing unusual was found. Just as Metal was becoming frustrated with this information, Jack and Sabrina arrived timely. Sabrina reported that the captain had fainted during training. Kneeling before His Highness, she explained the entire situation and how Lewis had been unable to leave work that day. She also stated that thanks to his diligence, the captain was practically working himself to death. Given Metal's likely lack of time to check the documents due to his state duties, Louis did not immediately realize that his partner was trying to help him, so he tried to object. Eventually, however, the blonde acknowledged his oversight, which Louis found honorable. Metal promised full support in catching the serial killer and offered to provide a squad of knights if the captain wished. In return, His Highness expressed a desire to see Louis not just for an hour a day, but at every meal and bedtime, until he was convinced that the young man had fully recovered. The captain realized that the blonde was quite literally commanding him to eat and sleep in the same bedroom. Metal promised to monitor even the slightest changes in his health. Lewis found it inappropriate to focus on his body when the criminal was still at large, unable to fathom why His Highness would spend so much time on him. With a dismissive snort at such a statement, the blonde turned to the vice-captains, inquiring if they had found anything. It turned out that although there was nothing significant in the immediate vicinity, a witness had seen a suspicious carriage near a haberdashery close to where the body was found, which had died a few days prior. The witness claimed the carriage had briefly stopped before moving on. Searching for this specific carriage would take some time, and it was still uncertain if the killer always operated this way. With his arms crossed, Metal asked if by any chance anyone had seen a similar carriage nearby. The response was negative. The vice-captains tried to gather any information about the latest victim, but to no avail. Glancing around, the blonde suddenly pointed to the table he had just been sitting at, curious about who had been seated there the previous night. As evening approached, all four returned to the tavern under the guise of another minor search. Mattel approached the woman at the bar, requesting a list of guests. Upon receiving it, he learned that another person worked the night shift. Just then, the night worker peered tentatively into the tavern. His Highness immediately began to ask probing questions, though the responses were far from satisfactory. The man claimed he had seen nothing, prompting Metal to insist he think carefully and confirm whether there had been a guest the previous night who arrived with a woman. The worker began to act oddly, as if he were hiding something. Deciding it would be quicker to find out himself than wait for an answer, Lewis headed for the staircase, instructing his men to check room 301. The man who had been sitting at the table the previous night was Rick, more precisely Rick Weir, a vagrant who put on puppet shows and presumably lived in a nearby hotel. From his regular spot, he had a clear view, making it an ideal place to avoid being seen and to watch others. Jack had interviewed this man earlier in the day. He stated that he had finished his dinner not too late and left the establishment. When Rick departed, a few tables were still occupied. He mentioned he was planning to move soon, so he could not talk for long. In the guest list, there was no one registered under the name Rick Wire, indicating that either Rick Wire or the name written in the register was a pseudonym. Knocking on room 207, Lewis hardly expected to find a scantily clad couple, and thus swiftly apologized before shutting the door. Metal, who had followed from behind, chuckled. He never anticipated witnessing the Chief Justice, nicknamed the Inseparable Parrots, with his wife, and the Count's spouse in such a place. Touching the captain's hand, the blonde explained that he was not the kind of person whose external appearance differed from his inner reality. Ignoring the approaching vice captains, Metal tucked a strand of hair behind Louis' ear, apologizing for his behavior. Not wishing to delay everyone further, Louis suggested they discuss this later and proceed to check the last room. As he knocked, the door cracked slightly open, and a red-haired man peered out. Asked if he was Rick Weir, the man panicked and quickly tried to close the door, but Louis deftly blocked it with his hand. Grabbing the suspect by the shirt, Louis saw a woman bound to a chair surrounded by various sinister tools deep inside the room. Seizing the opportunity, the man broke free and attempted to flee, but was promptly apprehended by the knights on the street. Louis thanked His Highness for his assistance, but Metal urged him to pay attention to his hand, which had been injured during the capture. His only concern now was whether Louis was prepared to see the court physician. As it turned out, no. Eventually, they arrived at the office of Peter Elwyn, a friend and physician to the captain. While Peter bandaged the injured hand, the Crown Prince watched intently, making Peter uncomfortable. Once the bandaging was completed, the physician bowed before His Highness, who recounted how Louis had praised him as the best. Peter denied this, explaining that Louis had said so merely out of camaraderie, considering him a friend. He certainly could not surpass the court physicians. Metal was more than satisfied with this response, but as Louis rose, he declared that treatment from a friend suited him best. He expressed gratitude for His Highness's concern, but affirmed that Peter was also a competent doctor, and there was no need to distract the already busy court physicians on his account. Suddenly, the conversation turned to a recent examination. Peter grew visibly nervous, prompting Metal to remind him that lying to the Crown Prince was a serious offense. He asked Peter to bring the examination results, as only then could the blonde be assured of the truth. At that moment, Louis's heart sank. Before Captain Louis could regain his composure, the matter had settled. Metal had barely deciphered half of what was written in the report due to the poor handwriting. Peter apologized for this and offered to rewrite the report, then present it to the Crown Prince. His Highness then ordered that all reports stored in the cabinet be rewritten and rechecked. As they prepared to leave, Metal approached Louis, reminding him that dinner was at 8 and promised that only the healthiest dishes would be served. Louis didn't respond, still shaken from the scare, when suddenly he was called back with a reminder that the game of the White Rabbit was not over yet, and he should not think about escaping. Louis merely nodded, and then the blonde vanished through the door. Turning to his friend, Peter shrugged helplessly. The examination results only showed mild anemia. Everything else was omitted. It wasn't possible to record everything given that it might be seen by others. Seeking to satisfy his curiosity, the doctor asked if the morning's article was true. Louis shook his head, prompting Peter to ask who the father of the child might be. The captain guessed it might be His Grace, Duke Wayton. Peter was shocked by the revelation, but ultimately, he was only concerned with one last question, whether his friend had made a decision. Louis was unsure. Moreover, he hadn't considered the implications of giving birth. Standing at the interrogation room door, he replayed the entire conversation that had occurred in the medical unit. Peter had advised against giving birth, explaining that if Louis did, he would become part of the imperial family, and his life would change based on their decisions. But if he chose not to proceed, he should resolve the matter quickly. It was already the 4th month. In another month or two, it would become a threat. Peter promised to help find a suitable solution since it couldn't be done here. They would have to go abroad. Feeling somewhat despondent, Louis promised himself that once the interrogation was over, he would take a leave, especially since they had already caught the most sought-after serial killer. Entering the room, he exchanged barbs with the murderer before sitting down opposite him. The man was right. There was no point in an interrogation if he was destined for the gallows, but Louis was merely bluffing. Suddenly, the murderer claimed he had killed no one. He started to explain that he indeed had dark thoughts and had planned to act on them but got scared. The deaths of 5 people were not his doing. After a few probing questions, Louis reached into his pocket, explaining how during the room search they had found something interesting. He tossed a neatly folded napkin with dubious contents onto the table. The man's face contorted into a grimace, revealing much. Suddenly, their conversation was halted by Benedict, the Empire's chief attendant, who informed Louis that the Crown Prince expected him at dinner. Noticing the time was already 8:12, Louis admitted his delay could lead to another unseemly incident, possibly necessitating a physician's visit. Interrupted by a knight who announced that Emily had awakened, Louis seized the chance to question her instead of attending the dinner. He asked Benedict to convey his apologies to the Crown Prince, promising to visit him later to apologize personally. Benedict agreed to pass on the message. The headline of the next day's newspaper proclaimed the arrest of Ryan Wyden, a supposed serial killer, suggesting that citizens could now walk the streets safely at any hour. However, the newspaper blatantly lied. That morning, a report arrived about a body discovered at the dump, gruesomely mutilated, just as while Ryan Wyden was in custody. The victim was Patrick Green, a 17-year-old bakery worker. Sabrina, piecing together the information, considered the possibility of either a copycat or an accomplice being involved. No further interrogation of Ryan was possible, nor could they glean anything from Emily, whose memories of many events were vague. Moreover, the Knights were now drastically short-staffed for further investigation. After Louis declined the dinner invitation, the entire First Knightly Order was recalled, as if neither official requests nor the Knights themselves were visible to the eyes of authority. Louis knew it was to be expected. The Crown Prince was not so benevolent as to aid a man who personally reneged on prior agreements. Leo surmised that His Majesty harbored a semblance of sympathy for the captain, as he would hardly employ such methods to aggravate a despised individual. The puzzle in the boy's mind suddenly came together. Metal spoke as if he knew that the man was not a real criminal. Sabrina also found it odd that the Crown Prince personally escorted the injured captain to the physician, hardly a mockery. Seizing Louis by the hand and pushing him forward, the girl suggested they first visit His Majesty, reminding him that he had promised to apologize. Speculating idly is futile. If the boy wishes to discern Metal's intentions, he must meet him face to face to truly understand whether he is being mocked or not. Upon arriving in the royal garden, the captain pondered what his friend had said. If even she noted how poorly he had acted, one could only imagine how the Crown Prince felt at that moment. Suddenly, the Duke, who happened to be nearby, or perhaps not so coincidentally, called out to Louis. Extending a fresh newspaper, Wayton inquired if the truth lay within its pages. The captain dismissed it all as nonsense, denying any hint of truth. To another probing question, he asked if the Duke wished everything to align with the written word. Then, Wayton admitted that he had been terribly anxious about how the boy was tormenting him with the weight, while he himself was already the Crown Prince's beloved. The Duke apologized, as he meant no harm. He was simply anxious and troubled, hence the intrusive thoughts. Noticing that Louis was not in the mood, the man asked if he was to blame, but the captain denied this, pointing out that the Duke indeed was not the reason, though he also had a role in spreading the article. Suddenly, grasping the boy's hand, Wayton began to pour out his heart, confessing his long-standing love for Louis. Left with no choice but to silently listen, the man digested everything said. A distinctive sound of a camera clicking brought both to their senses as the reporter hurried away from the scene, unnoticed by anyone present. The Duke tried to hold the captain's hand more firmly to draw his attention, but Louis pulled away, asking for his forgiveness. As he fled, he pondered the potential scandal that could erupt with Duke Wayton in the current situation. Catching his breath and gathering his strength, the boy finally decided to appear at the palace, where he was met by Benedict. Informing Louis that the Crown Prince was awaiting him, he asked him to follow. The mere fact that he was awaited surprised the captain, but he said nothing. On the way to their destination, the man mentioned what awaited on the table: seafood and vegetables, no meat, and inquired if the guest had any requests. To another's clarification that it was not mealtime, Benedict confirmed that it indeed was not, as His Highness had been waiting for Louis since last dinner and had postponed the meal, and of course, had not slept at all. Before the captain could respond, the door creaked open, revealing a vast room with a long table where Metal sat in complete solitude. The blond man looked up, noticing the newcomers, but remained silent, waiting for Louis to speak first.